Okay, fabulous. Okay, perfect. Um, Fine. Thank you for joining me today. So for the next hour, we're going to be talking about environmental sustainability for equestrianism. My name is Ruth Dancer. I'm the director of White Griffin. We're an environmental consultants who work with sports, culture, music sector, but we specialise about 80%, 90% of our work in equine sports, equestrianism and horse racing. And today I'm here to talk to you about sustainable environmental practices for equine businesses and why it matters. That was the title that I was given, but we could have also called the webinar something different. We could have said, how do we evolve equine businesses to be a resilient and prosperous part of the next decade? Oh, what's going on? There we go. And beyond, because in many ways, environmental sustainability, or indeed any topic associated with the environment to this point in time, has typically been lauded as a standalone topic. Maybe even an add-on to operations, or at worst, a tick box exercise. In fact, actually, I should say that probably isn't the worst of it. It's lauded as lefty woke nonsense a lot of the time, but that's okay. Today's session is hopefully going to dispel all of those misconceptions, and I hope provide some valuable insight into the reasons why this topic should be at the forefront of any equine business owner's mind, and what we can do on a practical basis. So let's start off with what are sustainable environmental practices? Well, perhaps you go to the heart of the topic and provide some insight as to what sustainability really means, because there's lots of feelings around that word, and it's an acutely polarizing topic. And I find that in itself quite fascinating, because what I get in my day-to-day life is that many people feel quite affronted by the idea. At the National Racing Conference, which is hosted by the Racing Foundation last year, I explored the idea of a link between environmental sustainability and something called the Kubler-Ross curve. Now, stay with me. I promise you we're going to get into lots of practical stuff, and we're going to talk about equestrianism. But I just thought that it would be useful to take a look at this for a moment. Because the Kubler-Ross curve, if you don't know, it's a model that was devised in the 1960s by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And it explains the grief process, actually. And it was later adopted in the 1980s by the business community as a way of explaining and supporting change management within businesses. Because as we all know, most people don't like change. And I'm reliably informed through the research that we conducted, both for the British Horse Racing Authority and for the British Equestrian Federation, that equestrians are particularly unfond of change. So why am I showing you this? Well, the curve shows that at any process of change, we begin with shock and denial. And when it comes to climate change, a lot of people stay there in that state. Even when we've heard the facts and when we experience the reality, we actually don't accept it. And then perhaps we move into frustration and depression, because we don't want to face what we know, and we react with anger and fear. And this is the place where I find most people to be at. And it transpires in a range of statements and actions. Here are just a few I've had in my time delivering workshops and in conversations with people on the topic. I hear this a lot, maybe even every day of my working life and even my social life, unfortunately. It's always rained, get a grip, it won't affect me, so I don't want to do anything about it. The dinosaurs died out and they did nothing wrong, all that kind of stuff. And when you read through Facebook comments when certain statements are made or products are launched, you see any number of these. Now, we're really fortunate that we launched the Equine Carbon Calculator, which I'm going to talk to you about towards the end of this session. And when we did it, we had the backing of the equestrian industry, including, I'm very grateful to say, the ABRS, and all of the land management colleges as well around the UK. So when it was launched, it went out on social media amongst many other places. And here's to give you an idea of the sorts of things that were said. This wasn't universal, but I just want to give you an idea. So the screen's probably very, very teeny tiny. So what you've got here is things like they'll track the amount of users and use it to batter horse owners with a stealth carbon tax. It's only a matter of time before they came for us. Try with China and India first. The list goes on. And what people don't realize is that this tool and all the other resources and everything we're going to talk about today and the strategies that are there to serve one purpose and one purpose only. And that is really to actually ensure that our sport can continue in years to come. And this, I think, is the best definition of sustainability from Gro Brundtland, that development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. It's not about tax or politics or making things bad for people, or throwing orange paint around and all the things that make people angry. It's about recognizing that the way we've been living for decades, maybe nearly a century, has a limit. And we've reached that limit. And if we don't change, then there won't be any riding in the future. So I've sort of adapted the very famous quote to one for today. So here's my adaptation brought up to date. Sustainability or sustainable environmental practices for equine businesses are about building resilience into today's riding schools in order to ensure and enable future generations can enjoy riding. That's what it's about. And so when we go through the bad news and the stuff we're going to cover off in just a sec before we make our way through to the resolutions and solutions, it's important to put all our politics and all our fear at the door and understand that all we're trying to do is ensure that we have a business for ourselves in the near future and for future generations. So let's take a look at what it's really about. I'm only going to spend a very short amount of time on this because I would imagine that the people who are on this call are probably quite well versed, but anyone who is watching this webinar afterwards, maybe this will be useful. So we know that since the Industrial Revolution, that we've been pumping ever-increasing volumes of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And then in 1950, you can see on the graph here in front of you, as a result of population growth post-war and the advent of consumerism, that increase grew in more of a hockey stick. So what you're seeing on the screen is human-induced greenhouse gas growth. And let's just bring those figures up to the present day. One second here. There we go. Technical problems all over the show today. So this brings us up to 2022. And people often ask, what was the impact of COVID? And you can see that little dip in there. And we know that because of that increase in greenhouse gas emissions, that we are heading on a continual upwards curve. There we go. And what you can say is, well, so what? The Earth's gone through those changes in history. Yes, it has. Yes, it has. We've seen increases, decreases, hotter, cooler. Yes. But this is the first time that humans as a single species have brought about such monumental change. And I always find it interesting that people who talk about the Ice Age and dinosaurs being wiped out, which I literally hear almost every day, they don't seem to be too bothered about the fact that what they're actually saying is, I don't mind that we're bringing about the end of humankind because it's just the way things are and it's the way things have been for billions of years. Because by putting excessive greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, what we're actually doing is creating this. So these are just images from the last 18 months all around the world, in Athens, in Portugal, in California, the whole of Europe, Hong Kong. This is New Zealand. And this image here is an image from a little bit earlier this year, you may recognize as Dubai. So this was Dubai, the desert state, receiving the heaviest rains on record. This isn't normal. So whilst, yes, extreme weather events have happened in the past, we can all remember, I remember in my childhood, there was the storm of the 80s and the this and the other. Yes, true. But what we have now is frequency and ferocity. And that's where we have the issue. It's speeding up. We're getting more and more. And while some people might secretly be thinking, well, I'm very sad for all those countries that are experiencing that, but we're okay. We're in Europe and Europe doesn't experience terrible things. This was a headline from just 8 weeks ago, maybe a little bit less. So Europe is completely unprepared for the climate risks facing us. We saw those extraordinary droughts last year. We've now got extraordinary flooding. And we can't thinking that we're in some way immune to climate change. And unfortunately, as I say, it's not just Europe, it's Britain too. So on the screen, you've got just some of the records that we've smashed through in the last 18 months. 2022, first time we went above 40 degrees. The warmest, driest, hottest, wettest, and then September, we've got 7 consecutive days above 30 degrees. We know 2023 was the warmest year on record across the whole of the planet. This year in the UK was the warmest, wettest February on record. And we also know that we've had the wettest 18 months since records began. And you probably don't need to tell any equestrians that, because we know. We know because we're outside, we're in the mud, it's affecting our businesses, it's affecting our horses. What people seem to not realise is that climate change means increasingly wetter winters. This is the new normal. In fact, it will unfortunately get a lot worse. And it's not just a problem because our turnout is very wet and it's fairly miserable having a wet winter. This is a headline from, dare I say it, the Daily Mail, and hopefully you'll see I'm quite agnostic. I try to spread out the different news outlets because the Daily Mail typically isn't very supportive of stories about climate change. But this was the headline in April: farmers warn of food shortages after wettest 18 months on record threatens to bring first year without harvest since the end of World War II. So we can feel sad about other countries, we can be aware of polar bears and orangutans, and we can either be aggressive about saying climate change isn't a thing, or we can be passive and say it's very sad, but it's not where we are. But this is now, this is today, this is the year 2023, and this is the headline for now. So all the things that scientists have been saying for a long time are coming to pass, and it's now threatening our food security. So we absolutely cannot ignore this. And as equestrians, we can't ignore this, because not only does that affect our food security, we know that farmers are struggling to grow hay, haylage, straw, miscanthus, etc. And the reports are coming through that that's going to have an impact on both availability and price this year. And some farmers are even saying that it's impacting the quality of their harvest too. And we know that we need good quality food for our horses to keep them healthy, and particularly if they're competing. So this is an issue that affects equestrians. And as we get further into the equestrian world, we know that it's not just the wet weather impacting our supply chain or our turnout, it's affecting our events. This winter and spring, our events have been decimated, particularly in the worlds of eventing and endurance. And whether that's directly, like this weekend's Chats with Horse trials, or indirectly due to rising insurance costs, which are a direct result of climate change, and that was what did for Gatcombe. This, unfortunately, is a trend that will continue. And that's not what we want as equestrians. We want to be able to enjoy our sport. We want to enjoy hacking and riding and all the wonderful things that we love about riding horses. And it's important not to be blinkered about environmental challenges, because in addition to climate change, we're also on the brink of a water crisis in the UK. The CEO of the water authorities has been raising alarm bells for more than 5 years, that we're facing severe water shortages. And you can see on the map in front of you that those light colours around 2022 are for low stress. So that literally means you can turn the tap on, you can have water. By 2030, as we get into the more orangey, reddy colours, we get towards severe stress. Severe stress means certainly hosepipe bans. We're fairly used to that now. But it means limiting water use. Well, if you go to countries like Portugal right now, I mean, that's not terribly far away from where we are. They're used to having their water supply physically restricted. So you can see that we're looking at certainly by 2040, but by 2030, some of you on the webinar or watching this afterwards will be living in those parts of the country with that very dark red that you can see in front of you. So it's really important. This information is very easily available on the government website if you want to find it. This isn't a secret. It's just it's not particularly being reported. But what is being reported are the problems with our water supply. And the answer to that has been increasing water costs. So I think actually this morning on the news, they were suggesting it was going to be around 30% increase. It could be up to 43%. And yet we've also got to endure hosepipe bans this summer, despite having the worst 18 months of rainfall on record. So when we think as equestrians, as riding schools, we absolutely fundamentally depend on readily available water for our horse welfare and potentially for our arena surfaces and other things too. So what we're looking at now is within the next 6 years, depending on where you are in the country, that yes, your water bills are going to go up. And yes, access to water is not going to be as readily available. So this is where we need to start thinking about resilience. So we know we're impacting equestrianism in general right now, but how about within our riding schools themselves? Let's be specific. Why should riding schools care about environmental issues? Well, the stakes are high, and they aren't high because environmental risk is an issue outside of your day-to-day running. They're intrinsically part of the same things you're struggling with right now, which is financial stability, predictability, the literal sustainability of your business. And here on this diagram in front of you, you can see that most of the building blocks that comprise your business are there. So we've got fencing, electricity, water, feed, bedding, equipment, insurance. I'm sure I've missed a few, but those are the fundamental building blocks of your businesses. And then in the line above, which is where we focus most of our attention, is the people and the horses. How much money are we getting in from our customers to pay our bills? What's the cost and welfare of our horses? Do we have staff? Can we afford them? If there are issues with the horses, how much is it costing for the farriers? How much is it costing for the equine vets? And for the most part, riding schools, livery yards, other equine businesses don't really look at the building blocks underneath. Most people are looking at the living parts of the organization, or at the very best, maybe focusing 90–95% of their time focusing on those green parts. And part of the reason for why we are where we are, and I'm not talking about equestrians or riding schools, I'm talking generally in society, certainly in the UK, is that we have taken for granted for the longest time the affordability of things and availability of things. In the last 30 years, we've seen consumerism change to such a degree that we've forgotten what normal looks like. We can order almost anything and get it within 24 hours. We've got price comparison websites to get us the lowest possible deal. And if we turn a tap on or flick a switch, for most people, you'll have an abundance of drinking water and electricity. But that isn't the experience of most people around the world, and it won't be our experience for much longer when you look at those forecasts, particularly for water, but also for other resources. So let's take a look at that risk in a little bit more detail. So the graphic you've got on the screen now is essentially a breakdown. And as we work our way through each of the building blocks, we start to see a bit of a pattern, that the things we need in order to run our riding schools all rely to a greater or lesser extent on the environment and the stability of the environment. So whether it's land and we need to be able to turn our horses out because of the weather, because of ecosystem, because of the collapse of the ecosystem, because we're removing our topsoil, because we're not encouraging a variety, a diverse ecosystem, we're impacting land to such an extent that it's boggy, it's impassable. It doesn't function for us anymore. Our stuff all comes from somewhere. Everything is made of something that comes out of the land. But with a growing scarcity of resources, that stuff becomes scarcer and therefore less affordable. Our insurance premiums, as I say, they increase as climate change is factored into our premiums. Our heating and our electricity bills go up. So everything is dependent. That risk in the middle of this diagram is dependent on the environment. It's the very foundations of what we do. And the advantages or products that we used to have can potentially be no longer there because of regulation or legislation. Red diesel is a classic example of that. The changes in red diesel legislation, which directly impacted our businesses, were brought about by the previous, I was going to say government, by years ago, whichever prime minister we were at that point, picking that particular change as part of the climate change commitment. Carbon fibres in our arenas, so that legislation came through last year. Even the way we manage our land and the subsidies that are available to us, they're all subject to regulatory and legislative changes. And those changes happen because of climate breakdown and ecosystem breakdown and the promises that we've made. So our infrastructure on our land is entirely at the whim of the environment. And if we look at the top there in yellow, where we've got damage, flooding, fires, storms, etc., it can all be destroyed by one extreme weather event, and we're not immune to it. We're experiencing this right now. So these are just two of the news stories that I've picked from earlier this year that you can see. So Paul Nichols, the racehorse trainer, having to essentially evacuate his horses from the flooded buildings in Somerset, horses being rescued from flooded fields in Leicestershire. It's not a vision of the future projected by data analysts. These are just two of the stories, but this was happening across the UK and it was being reported. So for some who are still in the denial phase of that Kubler-Ross curve, they'll say, well, we've always had floods. Yes, we have always had floods, but the point is the frequency, ferocity, and unpredictability of these floods, and those impact our businesses and our horses. When we think about risk, we think about what's happening right now, but we do also need to think about future risk. So 4 areas to think about: new reporting requirements, the need and expectation to report on our carbon footprint, for example, new legislation coming through relating to our transport, our consumption, shift in plastics, all sorts of things probably coming down the track. It's very hard to say in an election year what that looks like in the UK. But these things will all come. They'll either come through Mother Nature or they'll come through legislation, one or the other. And a big one, infectious disease. So farmers are struggling right now with the inevitable arrival of infectious diseases that are being reported this year in the UK, and they're impacting their sheep and their cattle. And although fortunately those diseases don't impact horses, they're brought by the same thing, mosquitoes, that carry diseases like African horse sickness virus or West Nile virus. And the fear and the planning currently going on for the predicted arrival of those diseases, because our climate is so much warmer and so much more welcoming to those mosquitoes, means that essentially our horse sport will be shut down as and when that happens. So there's lots of risk coming down the track as well. And maybe the biggest one, arguably, is the shift in perception and general progression of the environmental movement. So let's just take a look at that in a little bit more detail. So there are 3 areas here that maybe sit under social license. The world of sport is changing, and that means that expectations and requirements are changing. So equestrianism is funded by the UK, by UK Sport and Sport England. And both of them, Sport England just last week, but Sport England and UK Sport have both stipulated now that sports have to have tangible targets, change, progress, improvement plans in place to benefit the environment. For Sport England, funding is therefore contingent on us doing that. So venues and events across the UK are changing how they operate, whether that's green football teams, Wimbledon, Wembley, athletes speaking out about climate change, Formula One and sailing leading the charge in net zero. Sport is expected to step up, and our funding is contingent on us stepping up. So as a sport, it's incumbent on us to do that. We're expected to do that by those who engage in our sport. And if you don't want to think of us as sport, then as an agricultural activity, for more than a decade, agriculture has been adapting. There are numerous tools, grants, training, specialists, all sorts in the agriculture sector, because we know that that's a big area of focus. There are demands on both reducing emissions and factoring biodiversity in operations in agriculture. So when we think about land use and we think how precious and important that's going to be in the coming years, and I promise you that land use will be the watchword in the next 3 to 10 years. How are we using our land? Is it for food? Is it for nature? Is it for renewable energy? There will be a tension in there. And sat somewhere in the middle of all of that is us, horse owners, doing it for pleasure. And we need to be mindful of that. We need to be demonstrating that what we do benefits the environment. It's a positive thing. And finally, and maybe most importantly, expectation is changing just generally in the public. Equestrians and equestrianism doesn't exist in a bubble. We all know we have lives, roughly have lives outside of horses. And we know from our friends, from our other work that we do, that this is amping up in the UK and overseas. Some of the statistics you've got on the screen from the last year, 74% in the UK are worried about climate change, 71% worried that we're not on track to meet our climate targets, 71%, same again, shop in an environmental way. 69% of people expect sports to act appropriately for the environment. And the numbers are going up. Public opinion is shifting at quite a pace. So when we talk about social license, we need to remember this isn't just about using the horse as a leisure activity and all the welfare concerns associated. It's about how we're behaving in the environment. So if we don't change to become sustainable, we risk the foundations of our business, our sport, our lifestyle being threatened, damaged, or becoming financially unsustainable because we can't operate anymore in such difficult circumstances. So it's very clear that we've got a problem, both now and in the future. And doing what we've done for the longest time will inevitably lead to these consequences on the screen, which we've known about for decades. As I say, sadly, everything that's been predicted has come to pass, and this is the next step. So chronic water shortages, extreme weather events, wet, warm winters, hot, dry summers, food insecurity, resource scarcity, cancellations of our events, soaring costs, infectious disease. This is just the inevitable consequences of us continuing to do what we've always done. All of us, not just equestrians, of course, everybody in society, everybody. So we need to think differently and progress along that Kubler-Ross curve to acceptance and trying different things. Think differently to act differently. Change the way we perceive our actions. Because if we just open our minds to the possibility that the data could be correct and that what we're experiencing now is the start of the predicted future, then really, surely what we want to do is take control of that, take control of our destiny. We want to define what our future looks like and start acting to both mitigate against the worst impacts that are predicted, but also adapt to the inevitable consequences that we know are going to happen. And that's what sustainability is about. It's about building resilience and stability and self-sufficiency and control and deciding for ourselves how we want the future to look. And that's what all of this is about. Whether it's the calculator, whether it's strategies that you see, whether it's this webinar, it's not about taxes. It's about understanding our own impact and focusing on what's in our control so that we can start building a sustainable future. Many of you will know the impacts that we have that are on the screen. It's common sense, really. There's no magic recipe or special formula. You don't have to have a PhD in climate science to understand the obvious. Where we're using fossil fuels, so you can see on the screen in our infrastructure for our energy, petrol and diesel in the way we transport our horses, diesel in our equipment and our machinery, emissions within our supply chain, so feed, bedding, etc. It's also thinking about how we're impacting on the land and the ecosystem, the way we dispose of muck, the way that pharmaceuticals absorb into the ground, whether that be worming drugs or obviously very nitrate-rich waste from the horses. What we do with our waste, so what we do with our arena surfaces, what we do with large waste that we generate around our businesses. Thinking about soil degradation, the loss of topsoil because we're eroding through poaching of the soil, we're eroding that topsoil, and with the heavy wet winter that we've had, it just washes all that valuable soil away. Thinking about the water that we're using, thinking about the way we're creating waste. These are all things that are in our direct control that we can change to be part of the positive future that we want. So it's really about rethinking how we see the world and our actions in it. We need to positively switch our mindset from destroyer to steward, caring for our land, from being wasteful to careful, fossil fuels to renewable and green energy, from a linear model of using things, take, make, waste over and over again, to a circular model of using, repairing, repurposing. These are behaviors. It's a mindset. And this mindset helps us to become more resilient and equally answers the issue that we have in our riding schools of financial instability. This will enable us to totally change how our future looks. And there are very practical things that we can do. Okay, so that is mindset. But on a practical perspective, we've got two actions to consider. Using less and wasting less, which saves money, and investing in a longer term way to build resilience. And I know that's harder. And I think that's probably one of the big barriers that puts people off. If you don't have the investment to make, then how can you possibly be thinking about solar panels? And I understand that. But thinking specifically about your riding schools, it's about a 5-year plan of behavior change and investment. You can see on the graphic, we're talking about rainwater harvesting to help you be more resilient to the dry summers and rising water costs. So it's about using nature to best advantage. Iceland as a country is a great example of this. It's working with nature, not against it, not constantly battling against it and just taking from it. Installing LED lighting, which is more environmentally friendly, but saves money in the long run, or maybe even just thinking about installing more windows so that you're just using natural light, so you're not spending money on electricity, or even just cleaning the windows. I know that sounds ridiculous, but cleaning the windows so the natural light can get in. Solar panels, there's a 3 to 5 year payback on those right now, which again ultimately saves money and builds resilience to volatile energy markets. But there are challenges because planning permission can be difficult. So I know none of these things are easy, but at least if we've changed our mindset from the previous slide and we understand what does good look like, what does great look like, we can start working towards that. And helping the natural environment by planting plants for pollinators, for example, thinking about how you protect your topsoil and therefore not having boggy paddocks. And this is about thinking differently about your grassland management and how you turn your horses out. What swards do you have in your paddocks? Is it a monoculture or are you looking at more herbal lays, that kind of thing? How are you rotating? Do you have a track management system? Thinking differently about how we do things in order to build resilience and mitigate against the risk. And creating a business that is resilient means taking a medium-term view, but also actively monitoring what you're doing. And that's why we created a tool to help you do that. So earlier this year in, I think it was March, we launched the first nationwide equine carbon calculator. It's completely free to use. There is no commercial benefit to this. There is no reason for this to be launched other than to provide equine businesses with a way of tackling one aspect of environmental sustainability. Because when we think about reducing consumption and therefore emissions and waste, we need to be able to measure. And that's where we created this tool in collaboration with Derby College, Hartpury University and Sparshot College, because they tried to do it using agricultural tools and it didn't work. There is a uniqueness to the equine conundrum. So this tool, you can log on and use it, not use it. It's totally up to you. It's totally for free. It's not for tax or any other reasons. It's there to be useful. And if it's not useful, don't use it. But if it is useful, then it's there for you to use for as long as you need. It's really, really simple to use. You basically just create an account and obviously all of your information is totally protected by GDPR and all of those other things. And you start adding your data to find out what your impact is and therefore where to focus your attention to reduce consumption. The calculator was created with Farm Carbon Toolkit, who are one of only 3 agricultural calculators recommended by the NFU of over 60 out there. So equestrians didn't have any, agriculture's got more than 60. And that tells a story of the progress from decades ago when farmers knew that they were going to need to change. They've tooled up in abundance. This is your first one. So it benefits from the knowledge held in the agricultural industry, but with the knowledge and expertise to know how to adapt it to an equine setting. So when you go into the tool, what you'll see is essentially you fill in your account, and then you start to build a report, and you can see on the screen it's just cycling through how that works. And you basically pick your location. You input for a year, so whatever year you choose, and you input what's relevant to you. There's a huge amount in there to cater to people who have both agricultural and equine. Just ignore the stuff that doesn't make any sense to you and put in what relates to you as a business. And I'm just going to stop that and move on to, so you can see it in a bit more detail on the screen. So here, you can see this is what it looks like when you enter your details. So essentially this one here in front of you is the fuels tab. So once you've created your account, you go through each section: fuels, materials, infrastructure, fertility, etc. And bit by bit, you build a picture of your yard. And as you build, the ring on the right grows so that you can see in real time what impact the individual activities have. So you don't have to do this all in one sitting. Finding data can be a bit hard. Wading through invoices, trying to find receipts, whatever it might be. So it's good to just maybe pick a category and fill that one in, and then leave it to do something else and return to it when you next have 20 minutes to spare. And because the footprint is set over a 1-year period, you don't have to rush it. And then once you've completed it all, you will have your baseline. And at the end, or indeed throughout the process, you can see your totals. So this is the summary here, and you can see the very little, this is obviously a silly test thing I did for you, the tiny volume of emissions. But you can see under emissions, it gives you your carbon footprint. But then against offset, that's where you are able to put in what you have on your land. So woodland, hedgerows, etc., etc. And all of that acts as a carbon sink too, or carbon storage, I should say. So what you end up with is the overall balance between the two. And the report goes into all sorts of detail that you can then dig through. So you get a breakdown of your data by scope. So that's to do with the reporting framework. We do scope 1, 2, and 3. I'm not going to go into detail on that now. And it also enables you to compare yourself to the rest of the industry to see how you fare. So as people put more and more details in, we've got more than 500 people registered at the moment. And as they input their details, you'll be able to then compare your yard with others. There's also an FAQ on there to help with any questions you might have. This is very preliminary, and we're going through the next iteration of changes to the whole system. But importantly, by the autumn of this year, we're going to be launching the British Equestrian Resources Hub. And that's going to give you every possible piece of advice and guidance you need to do with practical advice. How do I install rainwater harvesting? How do I navigate planning for solar? What does the sustainable grassland management look like? Sharing of best practice, training events, everything you could possibly need. So once you've built your data in this, you know what to do with it, so that we can really start taking action that actually means something, not platitudes and greenwash and marketing gimmicks, but meaningful change. And that's where I think that the horse industry is so exciting, because we can actually make a difference to the environment. You know, sometimes when I see some of the other things that happen in sport or other areas, it can fall into the realm of gimmicky. And I know why it's done. It's done to raise awareness. But in equestrianism, we can actually benefit the land. We can make a difference to biodiversity. And that's what's so exciting about it. And it all starts with the baseline. And that's why I have created this tool with all of the other partners that we collaborate with. Because it's something in your armory that will enable you to be part of this changing world. It doesn't fix everything, but it's one of the important tools you'll need moving forward to build resilience. Essentially, doing your carbon footprint is a way of noticing and being more aware of your consumption. And therefore, it definitely helps. It helps you to work out where you can save money or do things differently. It's the Blue Peter model of having a target and then monitoring your progress as you strive to reach that target. Now, for some of you, that might be saying you want to set a net zero goal for your business. But for many others, it will be just making sure you're running your operation as lean as possible, that you can see where you can maybe cut back on things, or you can see where if you introduce something like rainwater harvesting or solar, or just turning taps off, turning lights off, where that will impact. Because this type of behavior is part of the experiment and decision process on our curve. It's the time when you accept and explore how you as a business can adapt and evolve to do the right thing for the environment, but in doing so, build a sustainable business. So it's two things. You have two motivating factors: doing right for the environment, building a healthy future for our children and future generations, but also ensuring your business and equestrianism can continue and thrive in this changing world. Because this is ultimately about creating a healthy future for our horses and for people. We're all part of the same ecosystem. We need a healthy environment to survive and thrive. That's just common sense. Most people take for granted what we have, our food, our water, our resources. But that phase is coming to an end. And now we need to really protect it and nurture it and care for it and regenerate it. That's just common sense. That's not science. So it's time to start prioritizing the environment and our horse-human relationship that we hold so fondly. And that is the cornerstone for everything we do in equestrianism. Because we're all in this together. This isn't about China do this and India do that and my neighbor does this and what about people that fly and they've got 7 children, and you can other the problem all we like, but what we need to do is we all need to change the way we think and act together so that we've got a vibrant equestrian community for everyone and a healthy planet to live on. Thank you very much. And if anyone has any questions, please do feel welcome to ask.
Thanks, Ruth. If anybody's got a question, please just unmute and ask. Anybody got any questions? Or I ask one. Oh. Okay. So my interpretation of what you're saying, Ruth, is that if we're to be successful going forward, this is about forward planning of how to make your yard resilient. So that could be looking at water harvesting. It could be, I guess, looking when you start to buy other horses, buying horses that might be more suitable for a future environment. It could be, we've got one yard, we know we've got a couple of yards where ABS members who are off-grid completely, have gone totally solar, battery and completely off-grid. Is that kind of how you look at it?
Yeah, it is really. And I think it's a recognition that things are changing. That yes, you can just about do things the way we've always done them now if you can afford it. But as prices increase, as the environment, the climate changes, people are struggling. And I think this year, certainly this winter, spring, for the first time, you hear more and more of that struggle. And as we go into the summer and autumn, we start to experience what impact that weather event has had on things like feed, bedding, food, etc. We'll start to feel knock-on effects. And it's that recognition that, well, when things change, I need to change with them. And it's that forward planning. So you have to accept in that mindset that climate change is a thing. And there are lots of ways that we can help people with recognizing that. But if you're already in that place that you recognize things are changing, that climate change is a thing, that the weather in this country is changing, and that it is impacting on our equestrian businesses, then we say, right, what do I therefore need to do to make sure I stay on top of that? And as you say, it can be something fairly straightforward like rainwater harvesting. I mean, that is such a basic that, you know, even in you know, we don't have to go that far afield. In Ireland, that's a very common thing to have on your stables. We just don't seem to do it very much in the UK. It's not really advertised. But it's, as I say, it's about working with nature. And when it comes to the horses themselves, yeah, I mean, I think that that's probably an interesting area of research to understand which horses are more resilient to the changing climate too. I mean, there's a debate going on amongst various charities about should we be planting native trees, or should we be planting trees that are more resilient to the changing climate that are not native? And in a way, that's a similar sort of thing with horses. Do we need to think about having horses that are more resilient to eating a different pasture or less, or have different turnout expectations? I think we have to get creative. And I think the next 2-3 years will start to look really, really different. And it's very sensible to get ahead of things now and to start planning.
Yeah, good. Oh yeah, I mean, we've been doing the remote competition, trying to encourage people to compete without traveling. So we've been doing, as the ABRS, we've been doing we did a winter jumping competition, and we're just this month starting 3 months of Prix Prilly. So anybody who's on the call who hasn't joined that and wants to, you please be in touch. Are there any other questions? Because we've run on because of my faffing around with the computer. Has anybody got any questions or want to put them in the chat? That's fine. No pressure on anybody. Ruth, that was fascinating. And I guess if people have challenges with the calculator, you're the person to talk to.
Yeah, absolutely. Feel anyone's welcome to get in touch. Ruth at whitegriffin.co.uk. Feel welcome to contact me about any questions you have at all. We are currently developing the resources hub, so hopefully in the future a lot of those questions will be responded to there. But certainly when it comes to the calculator, you can either use the query button within the calculator, or just get in touch. And I'm always really keen to hear people's stories about how they feel about the changing climate, how their riding school has been impacted, or their business, or even just their experience as a rider and a horse owner. Because it's by sharing those stories that we can really bring the topic to life and make it relatable to people.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So Ruth, appreciate you taking your time out. I'm going to stop recording now. And